Welcome, everyone. I am IPAC's Director of Research, Zach Spicer, and on behalf of IPAC, I would like to thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to be able to host Professor Paul Tahart. Professor Tahart is one of the world's leading experts on crisis management. He is a professor of public administration at Utrecht University and the Associate Dean of the Netherlands School of Public Administration in The Hague. He's formerly held professorships at Leiden University, the Swedish Defense College, and the Australian National University. He has spoken for, taught, and trained thousands of public servants at all levels in the Netherlands, Australia, and Sweden on issues of public leadership, public policymaking, and crisis management. Today, Professor Tahart will be speaking for about 30 minutes, after which we're going to open up the platform for questions. On the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A box. If you have a question that you would like to ask, just type it in that box. I'll be collecting all the questions and I will pose them at the end of the session. So with that, I will now turn over to Professor Tahart.
Zach, thank you very much, and welcome to participants. Lovely to be able to have this conversation with you. I just told Zach, ever since Holland is in lockdown, we've got beautiful spring weather, so there's this kind of strange paradox of us being, holed up in our studies, continuing our work while there's a forbidden outdoors that is extremely seductive. I'm sitting in my study and I'm overlooking blossoming trees, etc., and yet I'm here teaching you, but I'm doing that with great delight. Now, what ground do we want to try and cover today is obviously to give you a sense, or if you like, some tools for looking at the challenges of managing the corona crisis from a leadership point of view, and particularly a strategic leadership point of view. I will draw on some of the work my colleagues and I have done in this area in the last 25, 30 years, but very mindful of the fact that the kinds of crises that we have studied, although large and quite varied, terrorism, disasters, industrial accidents, forms of social violence, social conflict, etc. Still, corona is a kind of, one-of-a-kind mega crisis. So there's the academic in me that says, okay, I have a broad base of knowledge of patterns that I see in leadership and crisis management, but we are not sure whether some of those patterns will prove to also unfold as corona takes its course or not. But at least it gives you something to work with, hopefully. So let me begin by taking you through a very simple list of concepts that my colleagues and I, in this book that we wrote, the original edition we wrote in 2005, and this is you're looking at the cover of the second edition, which was done a couple of years ago. That we basically have chapters on each of those 5 concepts. And the idea is as follows, that if you're a leader in a crisis, what you need to be very good at, and your system needs to be very good at, is to make sense of rapidly unfolding, extremely baffling, intimidating, surprising, confusing set of events. And so you have to make sense cognitively, if you like, internally, of what is going on, what may happen, what will happen if we do X, what will happen if we do Y. So that's very briefly sense making sure that you, in this kind of continuously unfolding situation, keep a clear view of what's going on and not start to manage on the basis of incomplete, outdated, inaccurate perceptions. Secondly, obviously, we expect leaders to make decisions, make big calls. Lockdown, no lockdown, etc. We'll come back to that. But what we also expect leaders, particularly at the core of government, to do is to ensure that at least government, but ideally all of society, responds to a crisis in a coordinated fashion. That you do not have the kind of business as usual of siloed responses to complex problems. The need for coordination is really big. We also know from disaster research that coordination in a crisis is supposed to be the solution, but in many a crisis, it is actually a source of problems. It can be quite difficult. People go off, run off and do stuff, but they don't always align what they do, and there can be quite big gaps between what's happening centrally and what's happening locally, what's happening at the strategic level, what's happening at tactical and operational levels. The third one is meaning making, which is really refers to the great need that the community has to also grasp what's going on, to be told what to expect, to be told what they can do to make themselves safe or to contribute to the response effort, etc. But also meaning making in a deeper strategic sense, in a sense that every crisis obviously reveals things about our systems, things that may be uncomfortable, things that may be hitherto neglected, and many players in the political arena, but in the community arena as well, will start to make meaning, will start to ask those questions. How the hell did this happen? Who is responsible? So there is if you like, a political dimension to meaning making, which has to do with accountability, responsibility, blame, that also takes place. And what we see in if we study recent crises is that meaning making about what is going on the ground, and meaning making around what the political and policy implications of this should be, that those two forms of meaning making actually are intertwined. It's no longer that we are first managing the crisis and then dealing with the implications. Now it's all getting kind of mixed up, which then also means that the issue of accounting for what you have done prior to a crisis in terms of prevention, regulation, preparedness, and what you are doing or have been doing during response becomes a very, very big part of leading strategically in a crisis. Because you can do very well on the ground and yet suffer great, if you like, political or institutional reputational damage if you do not manage that accountability process, if you allow other agendas or other narratives to dominate, let's say, things like parliamentary inquiries, royal commissions, and so on and so forth. And finally, the long-term game of ensuring that what a crisis reveals about our systems actually then leads to forms of policy change, innovation, or affirmation that are intelligent, that are smart, that will contribute to us better managing risk in future, or being faster or more effective in the way we respond to future risk, crises, incidents, etc. That becomes very important as well. But despite all the efforts that go into learning the lessons from crisis X and Y, what we often see is actually that learning is not done very well. There's a lot of symbolic activity. People get busy. There are long, royal commissions with 200 recommendations that then become kind of tick the box exercises. Preparing to fight the last war. There's a whole range of learning pathologies. And so it takes a certain reflective capacity and also a certain protection of the work of learning from the politics of crisis management to ensure that that learning takes place and is also maintained even when the political caravan moves on to the next incident. So those are 5 important tasks that need to be performed in a crisis. Do all of them need to be performed by, the leader, the head of government, the mayor, or whoever? Certainly not. It can be a collective shared leadership effort, but from a kind of functional perspective, these are the kinds of things that need to be organized, that need to be performed. If not, others will fill the vacuum of sense making, fill the vacuum of meaning making, dominate the learning agendas, etc. So if you can sort of keep that at the back of your mind, let me now turn to making a bunch of observations about, okay, if this is what strategic leadership in a crisis is about, and we look at Corona, what are some really tough strategic issues that this crisis is throwing at us or will be throwing at us? So I'll go through these, and then I'll go back to some more generic insights from crisis leadership research. So we'll go back and forth between the general and the specific. So let me see if yeah, here we go. So what are some of the conundrums that probably people listening right now recognize and are dealing with? First one, very obviously, is that there's extremely harsh choices about triage and about managing scarcity, whether it is of IC capacity, whether it is of protective equipment, staff, levels of qualified staff, selection of patients, etc. Some really tough choices are being made, at least in Dutch hospitals already. I'm sure in American hospitals. I'm not too well informed about the Canadian situation, but it's happening everywhere. At the moment, a lot of these decisions are actually made at the level of medical professionals using their medical ethics. But when the pressure on these systems and the levels of scarcity, including the scarcity we can expect of medicine as supply lines from India and China for all kinds of pharmaceutical products may dry up, or at least may become less plentiful. Very soon, these will become public policy decisions. It gets taken out of the hands of medical professionals, or the medical professionals will turn up and look to the government for guidance because their medical ethics no longer suffice to make the kind of selection decisions that will have to be made. Secondly, since the choices are so hard, there's going to be debate about, okay, how pragmatic are we going to be if we have to make really far-reaching decisions at record speed? The logic of, well, you can't break an omelet without breaking some eggs, cutting some corners when it comes to privacy, when it comes to due process, when it comes to human rights, human liberties, civil liberties, etc., etc. Canada, certainly, like my own country, is a country that prides itself on its commitment to good governance and having, respecting civil liberties, respecting privacy, etc., etc. We have seen in the wake of 9/11 that equation, gets influenced by the mood of the moment, by the politics of the moment, by the sense of, whatever it takes to make us safe. And that then later we come to sometimes regret what kind of forces we have unleashed or why we haven't consulted more widely, taken more time, etc. So that's a second one. The third one is, and that's becoming quite topical already in countries in Western Europe, now that they have flattened the curve, there's this discussion of how long are we going to be in lockdown, or at what levels of lockdown are we going to continue to be? Since nobody knows about the end game, we can be in lockdown indefinitely for a year, 2 years, etc. Economic pain of that's going to be too hard. So the discussion is going between, okay, can we scale lockdowns? Can we scale them down in a controlled way? And or do we move to more targeted risk reduction policies, which involve track and tracing, and things that Western democracies are uncomfortable doing. Brutally risk selecting people and giving them very harsh regimes of quarantine, etc., etc. So that's going to be on our agendas. Fourthly, managing the economic upheaval. We have seen in the wake of the GFC how controversial and how difficult implementing stimuluses of the size that we are seeing around the world, how difficult it is to get stimulus right, to get the money in the right hands at the right time, to hedge against unintended consequences, wars, fraud, waste, ineffectual spending of those dollars. At the moment, treasurers around the world are telling us that they're preparing to throw everything at this, but very soon, critical voices will start to say, yeah, but what is this doing to the government's fiscal position? What is this doing to next generations, et cetera, et cetera? What is this doing to our pensions? So this is going to be very tough and high politics stuff. Fifthly, go at it alone versus learning from other jurisdictions, both within countries and across countries. I'm an Australian citizen as well, and the Australian Federation has been ripped wide open by Corona. We've had premiers, going their own way in terms of making decisions about lockdown. We've had states crossing borders, for people from other states and so on. We see in Europe, we see the same thing. But particularly the point I wanted to put in your mind is the numbers are varying, right? So we have countries with very low mortality, for example. They will be held up to us as models to emulate. And the pressure will be to say, why don't we do as the South Koreans did? Or why aren't we doing what the Swedes are doing? Or the New Zealanders are touted as being very effective. So there's going to be this pressure to import policy strategies, policy recipes and regimes from other countries. And we all know that copycat learning is stupid learning, but there can be a lot of pressure to nevertheless do that. So how can you learn in intelligent ways, and how can you build a case that we need to have horses for courses, that there are local, regional, provincial, national, regional differences that need to be respected in the kinds of policy approaches. Sixthly, particularly relevant in Europe, but probably also in Canada, to what extent will we coordinate, for example, the economic responses at a transnational level? To what extent do we want institutions like the WHO or the IMF to become more than just advisory bodies and actually start to coordinate things? And to what extent are we willing to distribute or to show solidarity? In Europe, this is very topical. Southern European nations like Spain and Italy, being extremely hard hit, are also already in a very bad economic position. To what extent will we see European institutions, European Central Bank, the European Commission, not force, but if you like, cajole member states into making transnational cash transfer payments, if you like, but also coordinating border control policies, etc., etc. Seventh, I think going into the early stages of this crisis, many governments said, we listen to our advisors and we have to follow the experts. And when they said that, they meant, your chief medical officer or some equivalent. So basically epidemiological, virological expertise. But as this crisis cascades into an economic crisis, a social crisis, we see all kinds of secondary effects from the lockdowns, in whether it is rising levels of domestic violence, depression, suicide, all kinds of secondary effects. There'll be other experts from other disciplines making other claims. And I think one of the really difficult issues in a crisis is, what expertise do you bring around the table? What do you do if experts disagree? You know, at some point you cannot, as a government, hide behind experts to make strategic, political, and ethical decisions. There's also, you know, quite a bit of observation how in some countries, the governments of the day or leaders of those governments are using the crisis to, you know, basically make a power grab, or at least that's the criticism. Countries like Hungary and some other places, there's let's say, a very generous use of emergency powers where people are starting to wonder whether they are still living in a democracy when all of this is over, and whether the use of those emergency powers is actually limited in time or can be checked by some body. In Australia, they've suspended Parliament. There is no accountability at the moment, and that they've now dressed up some kind of ad hoc committee to which the government is going to be accountable. But so this whole issue of executive power is going to be bigger and bigger as the crisis wears on. Then we go into this kind of accountability discussion. You know, we will have investigations, etc., and there'll be very, very tough questions asked about our levels of preparedness. Just as an illustration, we had the press here look at the 25 safety regions that we have in this country, and they looked at their emergency plans, and then they looked at what kind of planning have they done for a pandemic. And it was not a pretty sight. You know, quite a few of them had no or very perfunctory texts and activities when it came to pandemic planning, whereas other safety regions had very elaborate plans which were really based around bad case and worst case scenarios. So the authorities of that former group of safety regions will face some really tough questions about their levels of preparedness. Finally, obviously, never waste a good crisis, etc. There's this whole question about will this crisis transform the way we live, the way we do public policy in education, in social policy, in pensions, wherever. And so all of these sectors, we will have reform battles. People will want to push forward, get rid of stuff, add on new stuff. Others will fight to preserve the status quo and just want to go back to the way we were. So those are some really key challenges that this kind of sense-making, decision-making, meaning-making, accounting, learning needs to be applied to. Now, a few observations about tackling crises in a strategic fashion. I've got three sort of think pieces. In a way, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between, if you like, a big incident or even an emergency and a crisis. I think Corona is really a crisis, not just because of its sheer scale and complexity and its kind of cascading character, but also because it is the kind of incident, the kind of contingency that we kind of had at the back of our minds, but that we really weren't paying all that much attention to. So there is this element of surprise. And the pictures I've got here for you on the slide are, on the left, you see a picture of Genoa in Italy, where they had this kind of bridge collapse. I'm sure you've seen that in the news. I think it was about a year ago. And that bridge collapsed. You know, it killed a lot of people, but it also flagged something that the system kind of knew but didn't want to look at, namely that the shape of public roads in Italy, and particularly, you know, bridges and overpasses and so on, that they're in very bad shape. We know from reports that in the United States, about 70% of all bridges on federal highways are in state of disrepair. So when you have a thing like this happen, it's not just a bridge where you have to clear out the concrete and, you know, console the survivors, the family members, and you have to move, you know, a neighborhood, etc. You actually face a much bigger issue of what is this a symptom of? And so a strategic approach to tackling a crisis like this is not just managing the situation in Genoa, but it's actually addressing, the underlying issue that is revealed by that incident. On the right, you see the mayor of the town of Duisburg in Germany, who had given, or his administration had given a permit to a love something festival, a big open air festival, 200,000 people, but located in grounds where there was only one way in and one way out, which was through a tunnel. And people stampeded in that tunnel, and there were like, I don't know, 80 people killed or something. And you can see, you know, the tomatoes being thrown at him to symbolize the blood that he had on his hands. And here the crisis is not, or the leadership is not just about managing that incident, but it's obviously managing the powerful story of regulatory negligence, regulatory oversight prior to the event that actually created this crisis. The second issue I wanted to raise is that there is this enormous demand for leadership, for direction, for comfort, for decency, for courage, for, I suppose, positive role modeling, etc. And when that leadership is not provided by the people we have elected to perform it, they will have a very hard time, and others will fill that vacuum. Now, you see a picture of Trump. I don't think I have to belabor the point to a Canadian audience. So let me turn to the other picture. That was the guy who was the CEO of BP, British Petroleum, at the time of the Louisiana oil spill, a guy called Tony Hayward, British, rather posh guy, nice salary, who didn't see fit to go to the site of the disaster for the first week or so, or maybe 10 days. And when he went, he gave this press conference there standing on the beach, where he, after making the politically correct statements, proceeded to say that he wanted his life back, that, you know, he had it very tough in this crisis. Shares of BP tumbled, I don't know, 20, 30% or something right after that statement. He was out of a job the day after. So in other words, the demand for leadership is high. The stakes for getting it wrong are also really, really high. Thirdly, I think the difference between, you know, capable, ordinary, solid leadership and really super effective leadership in a crisis is people who play that longer game, that game of learning and reform really well. On your bottom left, you see the sculpted head of John Howard. He was the Australian Prime Minister at the time of the really, really big mass shooting in Tasmania, which was the first. It preceded all the American mass shootings. It killed, I think, 27 people or something. And within, I think, 2 weeks, he had come up with a gun control policy package that was very controversial. You know, rural society, people love their shooting, etc. Probably like Canada, but he got Australians on board for that. And the little diagram shows you the evolution of gun deaths since that incident, and it's been a pretty damn good record, very high compliance. And I could give you more cases of people who then kind of seize the moment to do something that looked completely infeasible prior to the crisis, but that the crisis kind of calls for, but still needs to be accomplished politically and in terms of, you know, effective implementation and so on. So I guess the take-home point from this observation is that it is important, while you're dealing with all those day-to-day operational tactical response issues, those million issues. My wife is a health bureaucrat. She sits downstairs. She's been working 16-hour days for the last 3.5 weeks. She's just fighting fires, and she finds it extremely frustrating that the time that she and her senior leaders in the health department can spend on this kind of strategic thinking about reform and innovation, etc. She finds it very frustrating that they are not making that time. And my sense is that that you need to find ways to make that time. You need to have pockets of people in your department thinking about those strategic issues and periodically plugging into the senior level discussions. No matter how busy these people are, they've got to have this half hour here, half hour there to think through the kind of learning reform agendas that emerge from this. Zach has given me notice that we're approaching the half hour mark. So let me maybe end on my initial presentation on a high note and giving you sort of the shape of what really effective, successful crisis leadership looks like. I'll be very brief. One is you want leaders and systems behind those leaders that attend to the reality of the episode, that do not flight into fancy, in denial, into wishful thinking, into kind of enemy images, etc. So you want this kind of reality testing. You want leaders to talk reality, to think reality, and not think fiction. Secondly, you want to have leaders who have a very high quality of presence. And I mean that in a very literal sense. We want to see our leaders at a time of crisis. We want their bodies in the right places, if you like. We want to see that they care. We want to see them meeting people and being seen to be honestly listening to people who are most affected by this crisis or who are fighting it, etc., etc. We don't want aloofness. Thirdly, we want people who play the short game and the long game at the same time, and who preferably align the short game to what the long game emerges to be, and who are at least on the front foot to keep thinking not just about the now, but about the later. Fourthly, and I gave you some of those terrible dilemmas that we're facing in the COVID crisis. We want leaders who organize, who ensure that balanced consideration is given to the issues. We don't want advisory systems around leaders that are monopolized by a particular type of expertise, a particular faction, a particular group of agencies. They need to orchestrate the conflict. The conflicts need to be had, and they need to be had in executive boardrooms, in cabinet meetings, etc. If you're somehow under the stress of the issue, succumbing to the tendency not to want to hear those difficult arguments, you have a problem. Fifthly, what we want is a certain, yeah, go ahead. We want to have a certain grace under pressure. It means we want leaders who have a degree of self-control of their emotions and so on, but also who realize that in a long crisis in particular, keeping going indefinitely is not an option. So we need also leaders who have the power and the wisdom to kind of step back, who have deputies that are empowered to do their job so that they can remain graceful and not strained. We want to have leaders who seize the moment. And ultimately, you want to have leaders who gain and not lose standing, to use Michael Ignatieff's beautiful phrase in his absolutely wonderful book about his failed political career, Fire and Ashes. You want, standing is crucial for a politician. It's hard to come by in this era anyway. And ultimately, you want to conduct yourself in such a way that your leader gains standing. Now, if you want to see what the face of successful crisis leadership might look like, I'm singling out Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand. This shows some footage, some images of her during the Christchurch shootings in the mosque, where she basically, all of us in the crisis research community agreed, has she or have her advisors read every textbook on earth about this? Because she did everything right, and not just in a kind of mechanical sense. She embodied that kind of, on the one hand, empathetic and caring leadership, on the other hand, that very prudent and cunning leadership. Because like John Howard, she pushed through gun control reforms very effectively with very broad support, which would have been completely unthinkable just a couple of weeks before the shooting. At the same time, she was just wonderful in regulating community stress and ensuring that this racially motivated attack actually helped unify New Zealand rather than divide it. Now, pictures tell a bit of the story, but I think this particular story tells a lot of the story. A New York Times reported that a couple of months after the attacks, the numbers of people applying for visa or to live and work in New Zealand had actually dramatically gone up rather than gone down. And when they dug deeper into this, it was actually due to the dignified, the smart, the open, the transparent, the humane way in which the government of New Zealand had actually managed this incident. So in other words, on the upbeat note, and then I'll stop, yes, Corona is, a really or category kind of crisis. But it's still possible to do it, to respond to it in ways that are give us the kind of government we want to see. Smartness, decency, transparency, accountability combined. And I hope that some of these remarks can give you some pointers on what that might look like. And I'm really keen to take your questions right now. Giving it back to Zach.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. That was a fantastic talk. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, you can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I see we already have a couple in here. I noticed there's a few about whether there would be a video of the recording distributed. We are recording, and there's a few people who have mentioned that the video may have cut out for them, or they joined late or have to leave early. If that's the case, we can definitely send the video afterwards. But going to the questions, the first one here is from Grant, and he asks, pressure is mounting to design a lockdown exit strategy. Do you have any insights about the Netherlands policy thinking with respect to a so-called immunity passport?
Yes, I think the immunity passport discussion is much more live in Germany than it has been in the Netherlands. Now, it may take place in quarters that I don't have access to, but it's certainly not in our press yet. I know in Germany they are talking about this. We did have a pretty significant article yesterday with a whole bunch of modelers coming out, both government modelers and a think tank of the best, if you like, epidemiological modelers from the universities that have now joined the government modeling effort. And basically the thrust of the story was that we have no end game. And all of the scenarios that they are currently modeling suggest that you're looking at, at least 18 months to 2 years of lockdown if you want to keep IC levels, manageable, et cetera, et cetera. So with that now coming out on the table and being presented as, the reality of the situation, my sense is that the Dutch government that initially was quite reluctant to look at things like track and trace or these types of passports and so on. In other words, to move from generic, let's all stop this virus, towards, okay, let's start to isolate and then apply some really harsh measures in a more targeted fashion, that discussion will now be accelerated. There is one scenario where they want to divide the country into regions and then sequentially apply extremely strict quarantine and track and trace type of methodology to a region. Sorry, I'm saying this wrong. They divide country into regions, they pick one region and lockdown measures there. Life will return to normal. Numbers of patients will come up. They will be distributed across the ICs in the country. The disease can have its course in a month or so in that region. You'll have lots of people who will then be immune. And then that region can sort of then go back to normal. And then we go to the next region and so on. Now, you can imagine how controversial this will be. Also, the sequence of the regions, the fact that there's a lot of cross-border traffic. So the passport discussion is yet to emerge, at least in public, but I think we've just hit the turning point where people are coming to the awareness that there is no easy option of only doing lockdown type measures. You've got to have a broader policy package.
Excellent, thank you. This next question is from Denise. Can you speak to how often a review of pandemic plans are necessary?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure.
Blip.
Yeah, no problem. The question is from Denise. Can you speak to how often a review of pandemic plans are necessary?
Well, I'll tell you a very interesting story. I started doing crisis research in the late 80s, mid 80s, 86, 84, mid 80s. And we formed a crisis research team, incidentally inspired by a Canadian, a guy called Joe Scanlon, who was a professor in Ottawa, a professor of journalism, who did quick response research. Whenever something happened, he and his students tried to track communication patterns. So they went on site and etc. And we copied their formula. So we had our team. And then we brought in, at one of our regular team seminars, we brought in a virologist, a guy called Hans Osterhaus. He's apparently one of the most distinguished virologists in the world. And back in the 80s, he showed us a map of virus activity across the ages, from recorded history. And you could kind of see that explode from industrialization, but then really take off in the 20th century. And so for Up and his colleagues, it has always been not if, but when. When have we got a really nasty global pandemic on our hands? So Up would say, you don't have to review plans very regularly, as long as you do proper planning, making proper bad case and worst case assumptions. And Up was saying to us then, and I think that has remained valid for the last 30 years or so, that the further you move away from the health system more into the generic emergency management system and government planning system, the less the inclination there has been to really look at this particular kind of black swan event regularly and seriously and allow the kind of worst case thinking to run its course. It is very interesting that if you look at, for example, stockpiling of critical resources, protective masks, and medicine, etc., almost all European countries are, how can I say this in a technical term, fucked, except Finland. Finland's got pretty serious stockpiles of stuff they now need in this pandemic. Why is Finland so well supplied? Well, it's not necessarily because of their regular updating of pandemic planning, but it's of their general penchant to think in terms of worst case and their awareness that when push comes to shove, Finland is alone, or has always been alone as a non-aligned country. They've had to fight the Russians on their own in the Second World War, and they've never forgotten. So they have been they are using their historical DNA in a way to engage in proper planning and stockpiling and drawing consequences. Whereas I think Our policy community, certainly in the Netherlands, has been looking away from the really rough scenarios of pandemics and a whole range of other contingencies, such as industrial accidents, nuclear accidents, etc., etc. I think you will find our planning to be there, but perfunctory, symbolic, ritualistic exercises that are too soft, assumptions that are too generous.
Okay, excellent. So I have a question here from two people who's somewhat similar. So from Joanne and Kalinda, and both questions talk about what how this crisis may transform public policy. So they were curious if you could talk a bit more about how the current crisis may transform how we do public policy, especially in the context of shutting down economies to deal with a health crisis.
Yeah, look, that's very tough. I'm a mere crisis management scholar, not necessarily medical policy or economic policy expertise. So I've got to be modest. What I can say on the basis of our research, we've done quite a bit of work on what happens after a crisis, kind of politics of investigation and learning that I alluded to earlier on. And what we see after crises, if you look at the patterns of learning and reform after crises, is that there's a lot of what we call single loop learning, getting better at doing stuff you were already doing, learning how to work your systems more effectively, efficiently. There's a lot less of what you hear politicians say in the heat of the crisis, and you hear public's demand in the heat of the crisis, is the radical reset, the radical rethink. We hear a lot of radical language from the commentariat about how this crisis should sort of, get rid of neoliberalism, help us get rid of neoliberalism. We didn't manage it after GFC, and now we can finally kill it, and so on. That is not the kind of common pattern of learning. So this kind of double loop learning or second order learning, paradigmatic learning. For example, in I don't know what the Canadian healthcare system looks like, but in Holland we've got kind of a hybrid mix of public-private, but one that where traditionally we had more faith-based, community-driven health services. They have all been sort of, caught in this kind of neoliberal market conception. There is a strong groundswell from people working in our health system to use, if you like, exploit this crisis, to reconsider that policy mix. Because what we are now finding is that we have organized ourselves in such a lean fashion. We've been very good at it in many ways, that we now turn out to have, very little IC capacity, because we've become so good at churning patients through. And so we have, if you like, sacrificed redundancy on the altar of efficiency. And the same goes for our supply lines of pharmaceuticals. And we've basically agreed to let our production capacity, pharmaceutical production capacity, go and have opted for Indian and other solutions. So there is a groundswell to say, look, we need to rethink that. And at the level of then, big policy debates, budget policy debates, there is a sense of, okay, we've got to be prepared to reconsider what we spend on this. So I think we'll see some pretty fierce debates, but on the basis of past research, I'm not super optimistic that we're going to see a lot of deep sort of paradigmatic learning. I think we'll see lots of sectors learning moderate pragmatic lessons that are not too politically controversial. What I do expect, however, is a lot of quite radical innovation to take place in sectors like the education sector, but also e-health, that kind of the technical work of reconsidering the balance between face-to-face and online. I think this crisis is propelling us forward in this, and I find it very difficult to imagine that we will simply roll back everything that we are rolling out now. Now, you've got to take into consideration that should that be the case, including the way you work in your offices, etc., that has major implications for transport policy. We can see a significant reduction of demand for public transport in peak hours. We will see, traffic jams reduced if all of this happens. So even relatively small and seemingly technical changes that organizations choose to make as a result of this can have spillover effects in other sectors, both benign and not so benign. So if you ask me 10 years from now, there's no doubt that Corona will turn out to have had some transformational impacts. Whether they will be produced by big policy debates or happen, if you like, bottom up and in non-government sectors and business sectors, and therefore force the public sector to come to the party, is a different matter.
Excellent. So we have 4 questions open right now. Paul is able to stay a few minutes past 1, so not to keep him too much longer, but I will try to get these last 4 questions in, if that's okay, Paul.
Zach, I've got one, if you like, because I know the audience is mainly public servants. I've got one sheet sitting there that they might be interested in, which is what in a crisis do your ministers or your political masters expect of you? So maybe that's something we could do at the very end. I can run that by in 30 seconds. A bunch of things that I know from experience politicians are looking for from the public service. So just to flag that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the quick question here from Amanda. She says it was a wonderful talk. She thanks you for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
She said, a bit of a granular question, but what is your sense on the characteristics leaders should demonstrate around communication during a time of crisis from both internal perspectives with staff and external perspectives with stakeholders and partners? What will audiences be looking for from leaders?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. And indeed, I will be able to send you, or Zach will probably send you, links to a bunch of memos that a group of crisis researchers and I are writing for the Australia-New Zealand School of Government. And one of them is about this kind of communication, or what we call meaning making. So there's going to be a whole memo on this coming your way, or access to that memo. But let me say a couple of words. I think what people in a crisis want to see of leaders is a certain humanity, because this is so big, the pretense that we're in control, the government is in control, to try and communicate that would be laughable, because we're clearly not in control. People sense that, sniff that. So you want a kind of a humanity of leaders that recognize we're doing everything we can, but there's lots of things we don't know. There's lots of things we don't control. This is what we need you to do, or this is what we suggest you do. We keep chipping away at this, but it ain't easy. I think that's important. Now, in terms of internally, let me say something more about this external. We had our Prime Minister, probably like your Prime Minister, come out once or twice and do a kind of a national telecast, him speaking individually to the nation without press conference format. I thought that was excellent, and I actually recommended that they should do this regularly. And the analogy that comes to mind is FDR's kind of fireside chats, or our Dutch Queen's weekly radio message from London during the Second World War. People were glued to their radios and later television sets to have this kind of regular human conversation of a leader almost talking one-to-one to you as a citizen. I haven't seen them do that. I think the press conference format is less powerful. It needs to be had. There needs to be, the press needs to ask its questions. But if I were advising a head of government, I would say, do more of that type of intimate conversation. If you want to see that done to absolute perfection, watch Jacinda Ardern's vlogs that she's been doing. I've actually put a link to an article about her current meaning-making behavior in the current crisis, so not the Christchurch shootings. You must watch those videos, and the contrast with what some other leaders are doing is just very obvious. Now, internally, I think I would say over-communicate by a factor of 10. So this is a John Cotter maxim that I think applies to crisis communication as well. It's very important to keep checking in with staff. So when I mean over-communicate, I don't mean sending messages all the time. I think it's very important to also organize your listening and make it clear that people can share their experiences, share their grief, share their ideas, their energy for innovation, etc. So organizing listening and then communicating back the results of that listening into your organization, I think is very important. Because let's face it, in this crisis, nobody has the answers. So the answers have to emerge from the collective wisdom. So to be seen to be doing that, and to be seen to be listening to your professionals and actually working with what they are offering is something that will keep people engaged and motivated.
Excellent. Thank you. I have a question here from Jeff. He said, we often hear of the rally around the flag effect, where public support of a leader increases in time of crisis. But how sustainable is this? President Trump's poor handling seems not to have dented his polling numbers.
Yeah. Look, I think Trump is a phenomenon that will continue to baffle experts, political scientists for a long time to come. He defies the laws of political gravity. So, let's not get too hung up on that case. I think from a Canadian perspective, it's much more interesting for you to look at, your fellow, what will you call dominions, let's say Australia, New Zealand, etc., the UK, but also some Western European countries. And there's actually not all that much hard evidence of a rally around the flag effect. It's a nice metaphor and so on, and it's driven by American literature, looking at the many security crises they've had, wars, etc. So it comes from the literature on war. But if you actually look at the more, if you like, the more domestic crisis literature, there's not all that much evidence of rally around the flag effect. What we actually see is more like an amplification effect. What I mean with that is that a leader or a government that is already popular going into the crisis and does not completely fuck up in the initial response, actually, get the wind in their sails, so to speak. Whereas leaders or governments that are already unpopular or divided or very end of term, etc., there the pre-existing skepticism and criticism or boredom or people having stopped listening gets kind of amplified by the crisis. And for that category of government, it's much harder to fight their way back into public attention and respect. Now, the Trudeau government obviously has relatively recently been re-elected, albeit, it's not been a landslide or anything. But my sense from afar is that at least at the federal level, the government of the day going into this crisis still had the ear of the Canadian public. So their job is not to lose that ear. Whereas you can point to other countries where governments had lost the ear of the public. If you look to Australia, for example, their prime minister really messed up the response to the bushfires in December and January. Really, atrocious mistakes in not just communication, but actually the quality of his presence. He namely was absent and didn't see fit to return to the country until almost half of it burned to the ground. So that guy lost a lot of political capital. And 2 months later, Corona begins. And you can see in Australian public opinion that people are listening much more intently to what the chief medical officer, some of the technocrats are saying, than to what their national head of government or their government leader is saying. He's doing a lot better in this crisis, so he may work himself back in, but he's beginning from a low base.
Excellent, thank you. Since you touched on Canada there was one question from KP that's somewhat related that I would pose to you. I'm not sure how much you've been following the COVID outbreak here in Canada, but he asked, how would you say Canada has handled the crisis thus far?
Look, I really cannot comment. I would only embarrass myself. I just don't know enough. Given the high esteem in which I hold, Canadian government, Canadian public policy, I would hope, and my basis hypothesis would be that Canada would respond in a kind of measured, relatively intelligent fashion. What I don't know enough about, but I'm trying to learn fast, is how the nature of Canadian federalism plays into this. I refer to the fact that whenever there are transboundary crises in my other country, Australia, the Australian Federation is rocking and shaking, and there's awkwardness and there's conflict, etc., very quickly. They usually then are able to come to some kind of negotiated common approach after some time has elapsed. But there's painful differences. I remember the last influenza, the H1N1 outbreak. I know Canada has had that as well, and that you have a paper about it on the IPAC website. There were so stark differences in whether schools were allowed to be open or closed, whether sports matches and concerts and so on were allowed to proceed. The moment in which measures kicked in, the moment in which they were abandoned, and so on. There were big differences. Some of them could be explained by the course of the epidemic, but some of them could only be explained by basically jurisdictions not bothering to coordinate. Now, whether you are close to that model or closer to a much more coordinated federalism, I don't know. But that's something certainly that is being tested as we speak right now.
Excellent, thank you. And just one final question, and I think it's a very good one, and we'll wrap up on this note. So Jean-Francois asks, many people wait for a return to normality. How can strategic leadership help tackle people's anxiety and move forward with resilience? How can we use the many considerations to innovate and transform policy? So I guess the question is really about how do we kind of tackle anxiety and sort of build confidence?
Yeah, here I will give you perhaps a somewhat controversial answer. I think the way to not do this is to promise people that we will go back to the way we were. We often see leaders do this in the wake of disasters. They go to like a bushfire site and they will say, we will rebuild this town, house by house, street by street, brick by brick. And the reality is it ain't gonna happen. Or it will take 10 years. But often, crises actually change communities in a physical sense, but also in a psychological sense. So there is loss, there is grief to deal with. And that cannot be willed away by making promises that governments turn out not to be able to keep. So I think the first lesson is do not overpromise. don't be naive about the reality of, really deep anxiety, stress, fear, loss, and conflict. Go back to that list of 10 things. There's going to be plenty of conflict that we're still having to have, and that's going to occur. So I'm very persuaded by the work of a guy called Ronald Heifetz, a guy at Harvard, a leadership guru, if you like. And he says that the job of leadership, particularly also in crisis situations, is actually to disclose some of those realities and to actually name those anxieties, to name those conflicts, and to find ways of having mature conversations about them, rather than a kind of make pretend government will fix it strategy, which may bring short-term relief, but is a sure recipe for long-term disappointment, anger, etc. So I would invite you to have a look at the work of Heifetz. There's a couple of his papers you can just grab offline. A very good one is called The Work of Leadership, where he actually says your job paradoxically as a leader may be to turn up the heat rather than to turn down the heat, because our desire to go back to normal is so big that if you indulge that desire, you're actually missing some opportunity to actually have the conversations that need to be had to come out of this crisis better, different, stronger, etc. Whereas this craving for normality that cannot be provided is creating a kind of a community psychological tinderbox that I wouldn't want to be the politician inheriting that.
Great. Thanks so much. And you mentioned that you want to run through a couple of quick.
Yeah, just the last one. I can do that in. I'll try and do it in 2 or 3 minutes. So for the holdouts, the 70 holdouts who are still there, here's the final one. Let's see. I'll share it with you. Bear with me for a second. I'll share this, and then I've got to go to slideshow, and then I think this should be it. Yeah. So what would I expect if I were a minister tackling a crisis? What would I expect from the advisory system public service? Here we go. Number one, I want it to be resilient. I want the individuals to be resilient, the leaders of the public service. I don't want it to walk around with, hollow, sleepless eyes. I don't want them to be short-tempered, etc. The chances are that I, as a politician, walk around with hollow eyes and I'm bad-tempered. I can't have advisors who are. But I also want them to ensure that the organizations supporting the effort are resilient, that they're, even in this kind of long, very demanding crisis, that there is a freshness, but that also that they are resilient in the sense that they have a capacity to improvise and speed up and develop workarounds rather than going by the book. That's one. Secondly, I think it's very important that on the one hand, we want the technical expertise of the public service, but in a crisis, you also want the public service to be in tune with the emotional and political color and tone and texture of the crisis. So you want to have advisors who learn to look at what this crisis means in the way in which the politician looks at it. So as if you like, your political astuteness will be tested severely. Thirdly, if I as a politician or senior leader get completely consumed by the flow of all the here and now decisions, what I really, really need from my public service is to support me in that effort with their sit reps and all kinds of, next decisions that I have to take. But I also want them to have the capacity to offer me that kind of strategic advice. What will happen in a month? Or what are the options for a month from now, 3 months from now, 6 months, a year and a half, 2 years? You know, we have a kind of an economic planning bureau attached to the Dutch government, and they've done an exercise of 4 or 5 scenarios based on the length, the duration of the lockdown measures. And you know, some of these scenarios are very, very grim, and they are not very nice to read for a politician, but they must read them. And this kind of planning unit has the clout to ensure that when it releases a product like this, all ministers will read this, and the entire top of the public service reads this, so that they get to think about, you know, long-term implications of current decisions. Thirdly, I want the public service to work really seamlessly. I don't want petty rivalry, budgetary struggles, you know, silos, etc. You really need to pull together, and often public service is very good at this. And I've been to so many places where people say, why can't we have a crisis on all the time? Because that's the only time when we do coordination really well. But you know, this one, again, the sheer length of this will probably feed particular types of conflict that will start to occur. Namely, for example, the conflict between the people in the public service dealing with corona-related issues and those not. There's a risk of them becoming two very different streams of work, mental universes, high attention, high profile, high prestige, low attention, low profile, low prestige. Whereas obviously the country will also need to be governed apart from Corona and beyond Corona. So how do you ensure that there is kind of balanced attention for those two logics of governing? What we don't want is contrived consensus, groupthink, etc., etc. We want, I believe, at least good leaders. I'm not sure about not so good leaders. They want to know where the conflicts are. They don't want them, watered down, because the stakes for them personally, professionally, are so high that it's better to have those conflicts right in front of them before they go out to the community and make announcements, or before they walk into a cabinet room and have policy decision discussions. So orchestrate the conflict for them. Be tough in your advisory work. And I think, number 6 kind of feeds into that. And finally, we want a public service to have its bottom drawer well stocked. So if there is opportunity in the middle of this, as the Chinese character for the word crisis actually suggests, in Chinese, crisis means very big problem and very big opportunity. Opportunities are what they are opportunities, but they need to be utilized. And so for a public service to have ideas, to have storylines, to have packages that can be mobilized and decided upon, if you like, shovel-ready projects, is very important, because that allows your minister and your entire department to be on the front foot as we move from the acute response to the sort of long-term moving beyond Corona stage and learning from Corona stage. So those were the little tips and observations I have for public servants in a crisis.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And with that, we will wrap up. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I would especially like to thank Professor Tart for joining us. As everyone can imagine, his skills are very much in demand these days. So thank you very much for making the time to join us. As he did mention, he has written a series of policy briefs for ANZOG. You can find those on our website, and I'm sure that we can distribute them to everyone who joined us today. You can also find his book, The Politics of Crisis Management, at most bookstores, including Amazon and Chapters here in Canada. So once again, thank you very much for everyone for joining us, and keep an eye on our website for future upcoming webinars. Thanks so much.
Zach, thanks very much. I will also make the PowerPoint, the slides available. So you can put them on the IPAC website or send them to participants on request or whatever. And maybe final word, I hope that in a post-corona world, which will somehow appear at some point, we can meet. I'm working with 4 excellent Canadian colleagues on a book about great policy successes in Canada. And I'm hoping that, that in that book, which will probably be ready in a year or 2, we can also have a case study about Canada's response to Corona. But that's up to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.